Hello, my name is David Skidmore. I'm a professor at Drake University, and today I'm going to be um, sharing with you some thoughts about China's rise and its implications for the liberal international order. And today's talk is based upon a paper that Matthew Stephen and I did, published by the Chinese Journal of International Politics. Um, the paper doesn't address the whole breadth of implications raised by China's rise and the liberal international order, but focuses in particular on China's decision to create and to flesh out the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, or AIIB. So we're examining um, whether the case of AIIB offers any insights into the broader question of whether China, as by some characterizations as an illiberal state, whether it will serve as a challenge to the liberal international order as its power grows. So what we do in the paper is to actually examine four different theories, two state-centered theories and two societal-centered theories. Each theory we examine what kinds of predictions would each theory offer in terms of in terms of explaining two questions. One is why China chose to sponsor a new international development bank, and the second is how do we explain the particular focus or purpose of the bank, in this case, focusing on infrastructure. So, what I'd like to do is to walk through each of the four different theories and try to assess how well the predictions that we draw from the theories fit the actual evidence presented by the case. And then at the end, I'll offer some broader thoughts on China's rise and the liberal international order. So first, let's begin by defining the liberal international order. We basically define it as an international order that is animated by liberal norms and purposes. And so, a liberal international order is at a minimum an open, transparent, rule-based, multilateral order, and in economic terms, a market-oriented order. Now, others may add additional elements to that description. Others may wish to subtract some of the elements that we've included, but we think that open, transparent, rule-based, multilateral order focus on markets exchange is a pretty good starting point, at least, for understanding what we mean by a liberal international order. So, how does China's rise impact the stability and the purposes of that order? Well, let's again talk about begin focusing on our theories and drawing out some implications, and then testing them against the evidence presented by the case of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. So the first two theories that we examine are both state-centric theories, meaning that they both revolve around state action and state behavior, basically treat states as sovereign, rational, gain-seeking agents. Neither of them really focus very much on societal actors, non-state actors, or broader issues of identity or social construction. So let's begin with the first one is liberal or functionalist theory. The second is realist, or we might call it distributive or statist theory. And we'll start with liberal functionalism. And the theory basically treats international institutions as mechanisms that states create to enhance the realization of joint gains. So states create institutions because they facilitate cooperation, They lower transaction costs. They solve collective action problems. They provide more symmetrical information. The kinds of issues that Robert Cohen and Joseph Nye pointed out in their uh, work on power and interdependence, and later Cohen's work in After Hegemony. So international institutions serve to enhance joint gains. A problem, however, is that as institutions age, they become bloated, inefficient, they become uh, burdened with new mandates. The membership expands, the bureaucracy tends to bloat, and so institutions become less efficient at realizing joint gains for states, the principles. Now, uh, functionalist theory basically says that why do new institutions arise? They arise when bargaining failures within older institutions block corrective action and make it impossible uh, to fix some of the problems that emerge over time. So, from this perspective, AIIB would simply represent an effort to create an alternative to the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, and other international development banks, one that would be more efficient, more focused, and more responsive to member states. If this is in fact the case, then AIIB does not represent any um, basic challenge to the liberal international order or its rules and norms. It doesn't represent even a real serious redistribution of power within the international system. It's simply a kind of almost a technical kind of reform within the existing liberal international order, and in particular within the development bank sector. So, what is the evidence? Well, it's certainly true that many commentators, including Chinese officials, have long criticized the World Bank in particular, but also to a lesser extent the Asian Development Bank as for its inefficiency, red tape, the bloated bureaucracy, lack of focus. There have been attempts to reform the World Bank, some incremental progress here and there, but in general, the problems have seemed to accumulate over time. China, in rolling out the AIIB, in fact, focused in particular on these inefficiencies in the existing international development banks, promised that the AIIB would be lean, it would be speedier, less overhead, less red tape, and would have a narrower, more focused mandate. So in those respects, the story of AIIB's creation conforms rather closely to the functionalist argument. Another element here is that China expressed hope that AIIB would not only offer an alternative to the existing international development banks, but would also serve to provide competition and in that way prod those banks to reform their own institutions. And so, in fact, we have seen promises by the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, to become faster, more efficient, and also to become play a bigger role in infrastructure investment in particular. So, in that sense, AIIB served two purposes: one, to create a more efficient alternative bank, but also perhaps to push the existing banks to address some of the institutional pathologies that may have made them less capable of helping states realize the joint gains that they're meant to provide. Well, what about what we call distributive theory, because it focuses on the distribution of power? Basically, we're talking about realist arguments. And here, the assumption is that international institutions, in their rules, in their decision-making processes, and in their particular substantive focus, really reflect the underlying power of stakeholders. And so they are instruments for the most powerful countries. Now, what happens over time, however, is that at the moment of creation, an institution closely mirrors the underlying distribution of power among states. But over time, that distribution of power changes as some countries grow faster than others. As a result, the institution's initial rules, if they don't keep up, will tend to become less and less well aligned with the underlying distribution of power over time. So, if that's the case, we might expect that eventually a rising power will seek to create alternative institutions that are better aligned with the rising power's increased weight or power within the international system. Now, in fact, there's evidence for this in that China expressed considerable dissatisfaction with the allocation of voting shares within the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank for many years prior to creating the AIIB. And in fact, not only China, but other emerging countries as well. The voting distribution heavily favored Western countries, and particularly the United States and Europe. And the ADB, Japan had the basic veto power. And so, even though there were efforts, particularly in 2010, to reallocate voting shares, those were blocked for a number of years by the U.S. Congress, and even those, once they finally went through, they provided for China's voting share to fall well below its overall weight, GDP weight in the global economy. So one argument is that China simply created a new institution where it would have greater voice. The United States being the most dominant player within the World Bank, Japan within the Asian Development Bank, now China would play the same role with respect to the AIIB. Now, this is convincing as far as it goes, but what it ignores is that China passed up a number of important opportunities to pursue even stronger relative gains at the expense of other states. So, for instance, China, instead of maintaining exclusivity in its dominance of the AIB, actually offered and even encouraged other countries, major powers, to join. So China said that the United States, the European countries, Japan were all welcome to join, and that China hoped that they would. That would have, and it did in the case of a number of European countries did join, although Japan and the United States did not. And of course, as they joined, that diluted China's voting strength within the AIB. China initially started out with a veto, but said that as its voting share fell below the 25% veto level, then they would allow that to happen and thus give up the ability to carry out a unilateral veto within the institution. Again, not what you would expect should China have been motivated solely by relative gain seeking. There were other factors. For instance, the AIB, rather than trying to compete head-on against the World Bank or the Asian Development Bank in a kind of clash of institutions, instead, its early loans were carried out in co-sponsorship with the World Bank and with the ADB, and in fact as a junior partner. So the AIIB essentially, instead of trying to undermine the other banks, essentially partnered with them. Moreover, while some speculated initially that AIIB would be one mechanism by which China would try to internationalize the renminbi and and increase its weight in the global financial system. In fact, China chose to make loans in US dollars. So the if relative gains were the main factor for China, um, they would have made some very different choices in how they manage the bank and the membership composition. Now, there is an element of the story, however, which does fit relative gain seeking behavior, but it was not on China's part, but on the part of the United States. The United States did treat AIB as an unwelcome threat to the existing international development banks. In fact, argued that AIB would lead a race to the bottom in standards and encouraged its allies to not join the bank. Did everything it could, in fact, to undermine the bank. So, in that respect, the United States itself, uh, one could argue that it tried to maintain its own relative power by fending off this newcomer. Um, the verdict, in my view, is that with for both these two theories, is that we can see that AIIB does bring about a modest increase in China's weight or voice within the international development bank sector, um, but that they haven't challenged the existing institutions in a zero-sum fashion. Um, so it's not very convincing, the overall gist of the distributive argument. Well, what about societal theories? These theories basically focus on the question of whether China conforms to or challenges the underlying norms of the international order, and they offer two contending perspectives. John World Society Theory, John Mayer as one of the early proponents of this perspective, comes out of sociology and basically argues that the unfolding of liberal capitalism over the last several hundred years has created a set of evolving norms and practices that serve to socialize rising powers to the existing liberal order. So it focuses on the idea that new or rising powers become rapidly assimilated and are forced to adapt to the existing norms and order, perhaps helping to bring about some incremental changes, but nothing fundamental. Um, well, what about this theory? Um, this idea that basically there's that rising powers are forced by international systemic pressures to converge into to conform eventually to liberal norms, institutions, and practices. Um, and in fact, the argument is that China, in sponsoring the AIIB, far from challenging the liberal order, is in fact signaling a desire to join it and to gain credibility and legitimacy within the liberal order rather than serve as an external um, um, rival to that order. So, and this is certainly reflected in the fact that AIIB closely mimics the norms and procedures of the existing international development banks. In fact, AIB pretty much imported many of the rule sets. Even the staff and personnel were former World Bank or ADB employees. The policies and best practices very much were consistent with those of the existing development regime. Um, one way in which this socialization takes place is that Chinese elites, political, economic, institutional elites, through something like Chinese leadership of the AIB, become enmeshed in a transnational network of political and economic elites that again serve to socialize members of the Chinese elite this liberal into this liberal order. So AIIB, in that sense, increases China's weight, but in a way that that enhances it speeds up China's own socialization and assimilation to liberalism. Another factor here that's more material in nature is that AIIB, of course, has to raise money on the bond markets, and in that sense, it is forced to meet the best practices and standards set by international credit rating agencies, which is another of multiple mechanisms by which new players are socialized into a set of accepted practices and standards. Nevertheless, AIIB does differ in some respects from existing development banks. It, for instance, professes political neutrality in lending, which differs from some of the Western-dominated institutions that impose conditions relating to governance and to human rights, which are not part of the AIIB's mandate. Moreover, the AIIB is only a limited accommodation to the liberal order in the sense that it remains quite small. Its lending is really dwarfed by China's bilateral investment lending through especially the Belt and Road Initiative. And if this socialization process were really so strong and pervasive, we might expect that the assimilation that represented by the AIIB would be quickly mirrored in the case of the Belt and Road, but in fact, we don't see that China's practices through the Belt and Road with respect to, for instance, social or environmental impact assessments, with respect to transparency of contracts, with respect to anti-corruption measures. All of these these practices on China's part through the Belt and Road remain quite in friction with best practices and liberal norms in the development sector. And so AIIB, in that sense, remains a kind of an aberration in some sense for China, rather than a leading edge of Chinese reform and an adaptation to the liberal order. Now, our fourth theory and final theory is social order theory. And basically, the argument is that international institutions reflect the norms of and the structure of the domestic social orders of the powerful states that create them. In other words, rather than, as in the case of world society theory, the international environment, the international system, so to speak, forcing individual units, the states, to adapt and assimilate to some broader set of global norms. In fact, the global norms are projected outward from the powerful states as they rise in strength, and radiate out elements of their own particular social order. So the structure of their politics, their economy, their culture and norms and values. They prefer to live in a world where other states follow similar patterns and similar pathways and social orders. They prefer to live in a world where their institutions, their values, their norms predominate. And so they attempt to project those norms in a variety of ways, including through the creation of new international institutions. So in that sense, if we consider China to be that one of its principal differentiations from liberalism is that it's state-centric rather than societal-centric, both politically and economically. In that sense, then, we could see the AIB as a reflection of a state-centric uh, Chinese domestic order and an attempt to try to project that internationally and challenge the societal-centric and neoliberal um, construct that the United States has promoted over the last 70 years. Now, if this perspective were on target, then we really would see an intense competition between competing and incompatible social orders, one state-centered, the other societal-centered, and AIB would be uh, the leading edge of a Chinese created parallel set of international institutions that over time will compete with and attempt to displace an American or Western centered set of liberal international institutions. Well, what is the evidence for this theory? Um, if we look at the AIIB, it again, we don't see very much evidence that it represents this kind of full-on adversarial uh, challenge to the liberal order, except in that AIB is focused on infrastructure development. It means that it is, in a sense, externalizing China's own infrastructure-led economic development model, and uh, that model prioritizes the state-oriented, state-centered sectors of an economy, both in the in that the companies that, at least within China and often in other countries, that build and infrastructure are tend to be state owned, and also the many of the public entities that manage the infrastructure once it's created are state owned. So in that sense, um, the AIIB serves to strengthen the state sector of recipient country economies um, and increase their relative strength compared with private enterprises as well as societal NGOs and other kinds of non-state actors. Moreover, the uh, this infrastructure development abroad through both AIIB and far more importantly through the Belt and Road Initiative serves to strengthen China-centered supply chains, which provide expanded opportunities for overseas investment by Chinese state-owned enterprises. And with looking more broadly than just AIIB, looking at Belt and Road Initiative, of course, China's own development bank, China Development Bank, and the China Exim Bank, both are the principal providers of finance in with respect to BRI investment. So here we find that uh, looking more broadly, that AIB is part of China's efforts to promote an infrastructure-led style of development that takes advantage of China's own strengths, that increases dependence on China and inserts China's state-owned banks and enterprises very directly into the economies of recipient countries, and in turn strengthens the state-owned sectors and actors within those countries relative to non-state actors and enterprises. So in that sense, AIIB might be seen as a bit more of a challenge to liberal norms. So in some, functionalist and distributive theories help explain to some degree the creation of AIB and some of its form. Um, the older international development banks certainly were plagued by inefficiencies. Um, they also featured misallocation of decision-making authority relative to the underlying distribution of power among the top states. And so in those respects, they were increasingly outdated and anachronistic, and thus created a strong rationale for not only the AIIB but also the New Development Bank and other uh, China-sponsored international economic institutions. Um, and these, it seems, did have and play an important role in China's decision to pursue the AIIB. But they don't explain the substantive focus of the AIIB, particularly the infrastructure, nor do they address the ultimate impact that it might have on the liberal international order in conjunction with other things like the Belt and Road Initiative in terms of the prioritizing of state institutions through infrastructure-led development. In that sense, um, societal theories are more helpful, particularly the social order argument um, provides some purchase or leverage that some of the other theories don't. But even there, I would argue that we also have to examine the even stronger, I think, if there are tendencies for China to wish to use its newfound strength to export some of its own model of development, so to speak. At the same time, even more powerful, I think, have been the socializing impact of the international system. Um, China has, in many of its legal system, its rules and regulations, its opening to international markets, has all been, and its participation in multilateral institutions, have all been uh, um, ways in which China has moved to conform or adapt to its rise within the context of a larger liberal international order. So China stands in a position of uh, partially adapting to and socializing to the liberal order, and partially challenging and attempting to reform and change that order, perhaps into something a bit different. Um, you might call it a liberal order with Chinese characteristics. I hope that this has been helpful, and thank you for your time. Bye bye.